23rd August 1942, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The sky above the Volga River turned black at 4 p.m. It wasn't a storm, it was the Luftwaffe. Over 600 German aircraft, the largest air raid concentration on a single city since the Blitz, descended upon Stalingrad like a mechanized plague. Junkers U-87 Stukas screamed through the smoke as their sirens wailed, releasing payloads that ripped through wooden apartment blocks, oil refineries, and crowded streets. Within hours, 40,000 civilians lay dead beneath the rubble. The Volga itself seemed to catch fire as burning oil spread across its surface, turning the river into a corridor of flame. Women clutched their children in basement shelters as the city's lifeblood, its factories, its homes, its very soul was systematically incinerated. One Soviet soldier, writing in his diary that night, scrawled a single sentence: "There is no God left in Stalingrad, only fire." But this was only the beginning. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the battles that shaped our world. Where are you watching from today? And what would you have done if your city became the center of the world's deadliest battle? The name Stalingrad alone carried weight far beyond geography. Named after Joseph Stalin himself, the industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River like a lifeline connecting the southern oil fields of the Caucasus to the heart of the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler's obsession with capturing it had become personal. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had driven deep into Soviet territory, but the Wehrmacht's advance had stalled outside Moscow in the brutal winter. Now, in 1942, Hitler redirected his ambitions southward with Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at seizing the oil fields of Baku and splitting the Soviet Union in two. Stalingrad, sitting on the Volga, was the key. For Stalin, losing the city that bore his name was unthinkable. It would be a propaganda disaster and a strategic catastrophe. On 28 July 1942, he issued Order Number 227, better known as Not One Step Back. The order was merciless. Soldiers who retreated without authorization would be shot by their own blocking detachments. Cowards, deserters, and defeatists would face military tribunals or penal battalions sent to the most dangerous sectors. The message was clear: Stalingrad would not fall. By mid-August, General Friedrich Paulus and his German Sixth Army, over 270,000 strong, had reached the outskirts of the city. Accompanying them were elements of the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, alongside Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian auxiliaries. The Germans brought with them over 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and the confidence of an army that had conquered most of Europe. Opposing them was the Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, a blunt, chain-smoking tactician who would soon become Stalingrad's most legendary defender. Chuikov had fewer than 50,000 combat-ready troops, limited armor, and a city already burning. The odds were impossible. But Chuikov understood something the Germans did not yet grasp. In Stalingrad, every building would become a fortress, every street a trench, and every block a graveyard. The German assault began in earnest on 13 September 1942. Paulus ordered a frontal assault on the city center, targeting Mamayev Kurgan, a 102-meter-high hill that offered commanding views over the entire city and the Volga beyond. Whoever controlled Mamayev Kurgan controlled Stalingrad. German infantry, supported by Panzer IVs and close air support, surged forward through the skeletal ruins. Soviet defenders, entrenched in bombed-out apartment blocks and factory basements, met them with rifle fire, Molotov cocktails, and desperation. The fighting was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever experienced.
In the open steppes of Russia, German blitzkrieg tactics, speed, mechanized coordination, and air superiority had been devastatingly effective. But Stalingrad was a labyrinth of rubble. Tanks couldn't maneuver through collapsed buildings. Artillery barrages turned blocks into moonscapes, but left enough wreckage for defenders to hide. The Luftwaffe, which had obliterated the city in August, now found its bombs useless. Soviet and German positions were often separated by a single wall or floor. Chuikov adapted brilliantly. He ordered his troops to hug the Germans, stay so close to enemy lines that German artillery and air support couldn't be used without risking friendly fire. Soviet snipers, including the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, turned the ruins into hunting grounds. Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Ural Mountains, was credited with killing over 200 German soldiers during the battle, including 11 enemy snipers. His duel with a German sniper instructor, Major Erwin Koenig, became the stuff of legend, though historians still debate whether Koenig even existed. What is undeniable is that Soviet snipers inflicted a psychological toll on German troops, who began to call Stalingrad Rottenkrieg, the War of the Rats. By late September, the Germans had captured Mamayev Kurgan after days of savage fighting. German soldiers raised the swastika over the hill's summit, but their victory was fleeting. Soviet counterattacks, launched at night under cover of darkness, clawed back portions of the hill. The same ground changed hands 15 times in 5 days. Bodies piled so high that soldiers used corpses as cover. One German officer wrote home, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. We bombard each other at ranges of 20 paces." Meanwhile, the Volga became Stalingrad's lifeline and its most dangerous crossing. Every night, Soviet ferries and boats made the perilous journey across the river, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and food to Chuikov's beleaguered army. German artillery turned the Volga into a killing zone. Boats were sunk, soldiers drowned, and ice-cold water claimed as many lives as bullets. Yet the supplies kept coming. Stalin had ordered that Stalingrad be held at all costs, and the Soviet command obeyed, feeding men into the meat grinder with grim determination. October 1942 brought a new nightmare: the factories. Stalingrad's northern sector was dominated by 3 massive industrial complexes: the Dzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricady gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. These weren't just symbolic targets, they were still producing T-34 tanks and artillery shells, even as the battle raged around them. Workers would assemble tanks in the morning, drive them straight into combat in the afternoon, and return to the factory floor, if they survived, by evening. The Germans launched their October offensive with renewed fury. General Paulus committed his reserves, throwing fresh divisions into the factory district. Stukas pounded the factories into skeletal frames of twisted steel and shattered concrete. German assault groups, armed with flamethrowers and grenades, fought room to room, floor to floor. The Barricadi factory became a vertical battlefield. Germans controlled the ground floor, while Soviets held the second, with fighting seesawing between levels. In the Red October plant, Soviet soldiers welded steel plates onto assembly line machinery to create makeshift bunkers. A German lieutenant named Wilhelm Hoffmann kept a diary throughout the battle. In October, his entries grew increasingly despairing. October 14th. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. When night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to the other bank. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. By the end of October, the Germans had captured 90% of Stalingrad. Choikov's 62nd Army was compressed into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, no more than a few hundred meters deep in places. German soldiers could see the river. Victory seemed within reach. Paulus reported to Hitler that the city would fall within days, but Choikov refused to break. His troops fought from cellars, sewers, and grain elevators. The grain elevator battle became legendary. 50 Soviet soldiers held a massive concrete silo for 5 days against repeated German assaults, fighting until only a handful remained. When German troops finally stormed the elevator, they found 40 dead defenders and grain mixed with blood. November arrived with snow and freezing temperatures. The Germans, still in summer uniforms, suffered. The Volga began to freeze, making resupply easier for the Soviets, but trapping German forces in a city they had destroyed but could not conquer. Behind the scenes, Soviet High Command was preparing a counterstroke of staggering ambition. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military strategist, had been quietly massing forces north and south of Stalingrad since October. Operation Uranus, as it was codenamed, aimed to encircle the entire German Sixth Army by punching through the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks. On 19 November 1942, at 7:30 a.m., the Soviet offensive began. Over 3,500 guns opened fire along the northern sector, shredding Romanian defensive positions. Soviet T-34 tanks and cavalry poured through the gaps, advancing rapidly through the frozen steppe. The Romanians, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking anti-tank defenses, collapsed. Within 48 hours, Soviet pincers from the north and south had met at Kalach-on-the-Don, sealing the encirclement. The German Sixth Army, along with portions of the 4th Panzer Army, over 290,000 men, was trapped inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide. Paulus was stunned. He requested permission to break out westward while the encirclement was still weak. Hitler refused. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that his aircraft could supply the Sixth Army by air, a promise that would prove catastrophically false. Göring claimed the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum needed to sustain the trapped army. In reality, the Luftwaffe managed barely 100 tons per day, and often far less. Blizzards, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and fuel shortages crippled German air operations. Transport planes, Junkers U-52s and Henkel H-111s fell from the sky in droves.
Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Fuel ran out, ammunition dwindled, horses were slaughtered for food. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed thousands. Soldiers wrapped themselves in Soviet coats stripped from the dead. Typhus and dysentery spread. German soldiers began to realize they had been abandoned. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and relieve the Sixth Army. Spearheaded by the elite 6th Panzer Division, Manstein's forces advanced to within 48 kilometers of Stalingrad's perimeter. For a brief moment, escape seemed possible. But Paulus, constrained by Hitler's orders, refused to authorize a breakout. Manstein's offensive stalled, then collapsed as the Soviets counterattacked. By Christmas 1942, the relief effort had failed. January 1943 was the endgame. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, systematically crushing the German pocket from all sides.
Soviet artillery pounded German positions around the clock. Soviet infantry, now equipped with winter gear and buoyed by success, advanced methodically. The Germans fought with the stubbornness of doomed men, but they were starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. On 8 January, the Soviets offered surrender terms. Paulus was promised humane treatment for his men, medical care, and repatriation after the war. He refused, still clinging to the illusion of Hitler's support. The Soviet bombardment resumed with annihilating force. By late January, the German pocket had been split in two. The southern group, trapped near the city center, was cut off from the northern group around the factories. On 30th January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, a cynical gesture, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: Paulus was expected to die. But Paulus chose to live. On 31st January, he surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, on 2nd February 1943, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Over 2 million soldiers fought at Stalingrad. Axis casualties, killed, wounded, captured, exceeded 850,000. The German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, ceased to exist. Soviet casualties were even higher, approximately 1.1 million, including over 478,000 dead. Civilian deaths, never fully counted, likely exceeded 100,000. The strategic consequences were immediate and immense. Germany's aura of invincibility, earned in the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939–1941, was shattered. The loss of an entire field army, including 24 generals, 2,500 officers, and over 90,000 men marched into Soviet captivity, was a blow from which the Wehrmacht never fully recovered. Of the 91,000 German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet labor camps from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad marked the turning point. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, had stopped the German juggernaut. Stalin's prestige soared. Soviet morale, shattered by the catastrophic defeats of 1941, began to recover. The victory at Stalingrad proved that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, not through luck or weather, but through strategy, resilience, and sheer willpower.
Stalingrad also demonstrated the brutality of total war. The city itself was obliterated, over 90% of its buildings destroyed. The Volga ran red with blood. Mass graves dotted the ruins. For years after the war, human remains were still being unearthed from the rubble. The city was rebuilt, renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, but the memory of the battle remained seared into global consciousness. Historians often call Stalingrad the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. After February 1943, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a successful major offensive in the East. The Red Army, growing in strength and confidence, began its long march westward, a march that would end in the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. But what made Stalingrad so significant wasn't just the numbers or the strategic shift, it was the human cost. The stories of soldiers who fought street by street, building by building, knowing that survival was unlikely, but surrender was unthinkable. There was Yakov Pavlov, a sergeant who led a small group of Soviet soldiers in defending a 4-story apartment building for 58 days. Pavlov's house, as it became known, was fortified with barbed wire, minefields, and machine gun nests. Pavlov's men repelled countless German assaults, turning the building into a symbol of Soviet defiance.
Pavlov survived the war and was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. There was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the Soviet Union's deadliest snipers, who fought at Stalingrad before being wounded and sent to the United States on a propaganda tour. Her tally? 309 confirmed kills. She once told an American reporter, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" There was the anonymous German soldier who scrawled on a wall in the Barricadi factory, "We will come back, or we will die here. There is no third option." And there were the children, thousands of them, who survived by scavenging in the ruins, stealing food from the dead, and hiding in sewers. Many became orphans. Some were adopted by Soviet soldiers. Others simply disappeared into the chaos. Stalingrad also changed the way war was fought. The urban warfare tactics developed in the city's ruins, small unit infiltration, close quarters combat, the use of snipers and sappers, would influence military doctrine for decades. The lessons learned in Stalingrad were applied in later urban battles, from Berlin to Hue to Grozny to Fallujah. The psychological impact on Germany was profound. After Stalingrad, the German home front began to crack. Goebbels' propaganda machine struggled to spin the disaster. On 18 February 1943, Goebbels delivered his infamous total war speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, calling for total mobilization and total sacrifice. The German people, he declared, must be prepared for hardships greater than any they had yet endured. It was an admission that victory was no longer inevitable. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a sacred memory. Monuments were erected, streets renamed, and ceremonies held every year on 2nd February, the day the battle ended. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, completed in 1967, features The Motherland Calls, a towering 85-meter statue of a woman wielding a sword, the largest statue in Europe and one of the tallest in the world. Visitors ascending the hill pass eternal flames, mass graves, and walls inscribed with the names of the fallen. Stalingrad is taught in Russian schools as the moment the tide turned, not just militarily, but morally. It is the story of a city that refused to die, of soldiers who fought with nothing but courage and conviction, of a people who endured unimaginable suffering and emerged victorious. Yet, amid the heroism, there is tragedy. The Soviet victory came at a staggering price. Stalin's Order No. 227 condemned thousands of Soviet soldiers to death at the hands of their own blocking detachments. Penal battalions were sent to clear minefields by walking through them. Soldiers who retreated even a few meters were shot. The Soviet system was ruthless, viewing human life as expendable. Chuikov himself later admitted that the tactics used at Stalingrad were horrifically costly, but he argued they were necessary to save the Soviet Union. The Germans, too, paid for their hubris. Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout, Göring's empty promises, and Paulus's obedience to orders sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. The German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad were not fanatics or monsters. Many were conscripts, ordinary men caught in an extraordinary nightmare. Their letters home, smuggled out on the last transport planes, spoke of hunger, cold, and despair. "We are dying here in the snow," one soldier wrote. "Tell my mother I tried." In the decades since, Stalingrad has been studied, debated, and mythologized. It has inspired books, films, and video games. It is invoked whenever leaders speak of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a reminder that war is not glorious, it is brutal, chaotic, and deeply human. Some historians argue that Stalingrad was the most important battle of World War II, more decisive than D-Day or the Battle of Britain. Others contend that the Eastern Front as a whole, not any single battle, determined the war's outcome. What is indisputable is that Stalingrad marked a turning point. Before Stalingrad, Germany seemed unstoppable. After Stalingrad, Germany was on the defensive. The 5 months from August 1942 to February 1943 changed not just the trajectory of the war, but the course of the 20th century. If Germany had captured Stalingrad, secured the Caucasus oil fields, and consolidated its hold on the East, the war might have lasted years longer. The Soviet Union might have collapsed. The Holocaust might have claimed even more lives. The world we live in today might look very different. But that is not what happened. In the frozen ruins of a city on the Volga, the Third Reich's ambitions were shattered. The myth of German invincibility died in the rubble of Stalingrad, and with it, any hope Hitler had of total victory. The survivors of Stalingrad carried the battle with them for the rest of their lives. Soviet veterans spoke of nightmares, of buildings collapsing, of comrades screaming, of the smell of burning flesh. German veterans, those few who returned from captivity, struggled to reconcile what they had endured with what they had been told the war was about. Many never spoke of Stalingrad again. Vasily Chukov, the defender of Stalingrad, went on to lead Soviet forces in the final assault on Berlin. He was present when the Germans surrendered the Reichstag. After the war, he served as commander-in-chief of Soviet ground forces and later as chief of civil defense. When he died in 1982, he was buried at Mamayev Kurgan, overlooking the city he had saved. Friedrich Paulus, the defeated German commander, spent the remainder of the war in Soviet captivity. He was eventually persuaded to join the Soviet-backed National Committee for a Free Germany, denouncing Hitler and calling on German soldiers to surrender. After the war, he lived in East Germany, writing memoirs and attending Communist Party events. He died in 1957, a broken man haunted by the ghosts of Stalingrad. Vasily Zaitsev, the legendary sniper, survived the war despite being temporarily blinded by a mortar blast at Stalingrad. His sight was restored by surgery, and he returned to combat, ending the war with 242 confirmed kills. He died in 1991 in Kyiv, and his remains were reinterred at Mamayev Kurgan in 2006. Stalingrad stands as a testament to the extremes of human endurance and the horrors of industrial warfare. It is a story of ideologies clashing with apocalyptic violence, of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, of courage measured not in victories but in survival. The battle claimed over 1 million lives, destroyed a city, and broke the back of one of history's most formidable military machines. But it also revealed something profound about the human spirit, that even in the darkest moments, when hope seems lost and death surrounds, people will fight, not for glory or conquest, but for survival, for each other, and for something larger than themselves. The ruins of Stalingrad, rebuilt into the modern city of Volgograd, no longer bear the scars of 1942, but the memory endures. In museums, in monuments, in the stories passed down through generations, Stalingrad lives on, a reminder of the price of war, the cost of ambition, and the resilience of the human will. And so the question remains, what would you have done? If you had been a soldier on those frozen streets, would you have had the strength to endure? Would you have fought, knowing the odds were impossible? Or would the weight of that nightmare have crushed your spirit? History does not answer these questions. It only asks them. But while Stalingrad consumed the world's attention, another front was opening, one that would bring the war directly to the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, and the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. Subscribe now and never miss a story from the war that changed everything.